Welcome to Museum Archipelago. I'm Ian Elsner. Museum Archipelago guides you through the rocky landscape of museums. Each episode is rarely longer than 15 minutes. So let's get started. I first learned about the impending closure of the popular The Streets of Old Milwaukee exhibit at the Milwaukee Public Museum, or MPM, back in 2015. The news came in the form of an email from a family member who had lived in the Milwaukee area her whole life. It was only a year after I started working in the museum world, and she was eager to talk to me, then a newly minted museum professional, about what a colleague had told her, that the Streets of Old Milwaukee, which had been there, quote, forever, was about to close. She wrote, "I was upset since this was always one of my favorite exhibits," along with the bison hunt rattlesnake diorama, of course. A little later in the email, she expresses a sense of relief, learning that the exhibit wasn't closing permanently. The confusion turned out to be a renovation that would temporarily close the exhibit for about 6 months and reopen in December 2015. The panic faded a bit. The Streets of Old Milwaukee, which opened in 1965, is beloved for good reason. It's an immersive space with cobblestone roads and perfect lighting that evokes a fall evening in turn of the 20th century Milwaukee. The visitor experience isn't peering through a diorama, it's moving through a diorama, complete with lifelike human figures. Visitors go in and out of inviting storefronts, old-timey police boxes, and a candy shop. I used to visit as a kid, and I loved how the exhibit transported me. I couldn't say exactly where it transported me, but it was exciting. I remember staring at a figure of a grandma, who everyone just called Granny, in a rocking chair on the front porch, trying to figure out the mechanism by which she was rocking. Today's guest, Dr. Ellen Censky, told me in 2015, when she was academic dean of the Milwaukee Public Museum, the MPM, on one of the first episodes of Museum Archipelago, that this attention to detail was one of the reasons why the museum punches above its weight.
It's an experience that you get when you're here.
Right.
It's this immersive experience. And so we really need to understand that as we move forward to make sure that as we enhance things that we don't take away what people love.
That skittishness over a beloved exhibit closing, or even changing, was apparent in the way the museum presented their 2015 renovation plans. Listen to Al Muchka, then curator of history collections at the MPM, describe the renovation in an official video.
"Don't you change my Streets of Old Milwaukee." That ownership came through, and we understood that. I mean, many of the people here in the museum that work here, we grew up here, so we understand the idea of this is our place. These are our things. So when people would call us and say, "Don't change my exhibit," we get it.
But that was 2015. Now, almost 10 years later, that fear has come true. In a few years, the Streets of Old Milwaukee will close for good, not just for a temporary refurbishment. And, predictably, the reaction has not been good.
Hi, my name is Ellen Censky, and I am President and CEO of the Milwaukee Public Museum.
Today, Dr. Censky is President and CEO of the MPM. The Streets of Old Milwaukee is closing for good because the museum itself is moving to a new building, and the museum says it can't move the exhibit since it's literally built into the old building. And even if they could, they probably wouldn't. So, let's explore each in turn. Dr. Censky says that the decision to move the museum was triggered by the American Alliance of Museums, or AAM's, accreditation process. AAM's accreditation process is a set of industry standards that is effectively shorthand for institutional credibility. The MPM first gained accreditation in 1972, and the accreditation process should be done about every 10 years. If a museum is not accredited, it might have difficulty winning grants or handling loan agreements for traveling exhibits.
Back in 2016, as we were approaching reaccreditation, for the museum. We were reflecting back on the past reaccreditation. And in that reaccreditation, they had cautioned us that the condition of the building was not adequate for housing the collections. It was deteriorating to the extent that it could be causing harm to the collections. And of course, that's what we are, is a collections-based museum. And they said, you need to do something about this. And of course, when we were thinking about reaccreditation, which was coming up in 2020, the building continued to deteriorate. It had not gotten better, and it had built up a significant amount of deferred maintenance. The building is not owned by the museum. The building is owned by the county. And the county has financial challenges as they own many, many buildings and have lots of things that they need to take care of. And so building maintenance for the museum was just not a high priority for them. So we headed into this study to see what could we do. Should we invest putting money into this building to bring it up to AAM standards and thereby receive accreditation, or should we build a new building?
The museum decided to build a new building. This annoyed me at first. Surely any maintenance fixes would be cheaper and, well, less wasteful than building a brand new building. I'm fond of the current building on 800 West Wells Street in Milwaukee. In addition to trying to figure out how the granny rocked, one of my formative museum experiences was noticing how the floor ramped down in the Living Oceans exhibit as we went deeper underwater. I remember feeling nervous as the lighting changed and I descended the depths. It was all very cool and effective. But you can find videos online highlighting the poor shape of the building itself. Not so much on the exhibit floors, which again are awesome, right down to the rattlesnake button on the bison hunt diorama. But down in the basement collection storage area, there's an actual leaking wastewater sewage pipe running right through the room, artifacts wrapped in plastic to try and save them from the humidity, and stalactites growing from the ceiling due to moisture. I think a big part of the answer to the why build a new building question is the ownership structure. MPM is a private, nonprofit company. Milwaukee County owns the building. Building something new is a much sexier donor pitch than maintaining something, particularly something that you don't own, and particularly when there's no guarantee of that maintenance continuing.
We also reached out to donors doing a study to see would donors support putting their money into a county-owned facility. The end result of those studies was that donors were not interested to put money into a county-owned facility because there was no guarantee that it would then be taken care of, given that it hadn't been up to this point. And they were also interested in supporting a new building project. So at that point, we headed down the road of building a new museum.
And that new museum will be right down the road, on a site about a 12-minute walk away on 6th and McKinley Streets. Critically for the future, the new building will be owned by the museum itself. Milwaukee County will continue to own the museum's collections, but will no longer be responsible for the building costs, though it will still provide some annual funding for collections care. Any additional collections will be stored at a separate off-site storage facility that presumably won't have the same issues. So now we get to, why not pack up the Streets of Old Milwaukee and move it to a new location?
The Streets of Old Milwaukee are built in. They're poured into the concrete in the buildings is poured into the building. The cobblestones are set in place. We cannot pick up and move the exhibits. They are so built into this building that it's impossible to do that. And really, we shouldn't.
It's this "we shouldn't" that interests me the most. And honestly, I'm inclined to agree.
The Streets covers a tiny part of history in Milwaukee. It is a 7-year period, 1898 to 1905. Our collections are much more expansive than that. And so what we are doing is we are having an exhibit in the new museum called Milwaukee Revealed, which is set in a similar kind of streetscape where you can walk through, but it is timeless in that it will have old buildings, it'll have new buildings, and we'll be able to share many more stories in the new museum, in the new exhibit.
The new exhibit, Milwaukee Revealed, will cover a much larger swath of Milwaukee's history, from the late 1700s to the present day. More people visit the MPM, and probably the streets of Old Milwaukee each year than the total number of people who lived in Milwaukee in 1900, one of the years the exhibit is set in. That kind of nostalgia really builds up. The exhibit, built in 1965, is about as distant from us in 2024 as 1905 was from those in 1965. But that's the fundamental point. The layout of the streets of Old Milwaukee was never a real street. It was an imagined street. What visitors love about it, what I love about it, is that it's designed for present-day visitors. It's designed to evoke a reaction. And oh boy, has it. Here's an interview on local news station Milwaukee WTMJ4 from January 11th, 2023, to an MPM Facebook post that the streets of Old Milwaukee wouldn't be moving over to the new museum.
This is Milwaukee.
We don't like change.
We don't like change in Milwaukee. Were you prepared? I mean, this started as a line in a newspaper story the other day, and it just kind of snowballed into, is Granny going to wind up in a dumpster when they demolish the old museum? Were you, well, that's what some people thought.
I think a lot of museum people, like me, draw a huge distinction between the collections, or the artifacts, and the exhibits, or the display of those artifacts. I think of the artifacts like Lego bricks. Artifacts are arranged in such a way to create exhibits. The models created from those bricks are the stories told. But we can make a lot of different models, we can tell a lot of different stories out of the same Lego bricks, gluing the model together forever, so that the artifacts can't be reinterrogated or the story can't be retold, is not what a museum should be. And it's also not how storytelling works. The same sets of story points, the same initial artifacts can, and I would argue should, be told differently. Maybe it's an arbitrary distinction to see the museum as outside of history, as somehow not subject to the same preservation as museums themselves are tasked with. But a museum is just a story.
We are at a different time than we were in the 1960s, and we owe the future museum goers the opportunity to see something different and new. We've done workshops, we've done surveys, and we've been doing them, getting feedback so that we really could tailor things to what people were interested in. My goal is that when you come into the new museum, that you see things that are familiar, but they are reimagined in a new way. And so if you had a favorite object, your favorite object you'll find, but it will be interpreted and imagined in a different way.
On the YouTube clip of that local news interview, the least angry comments talk about the need to visit the current exhibits before it all disappears. It really doesn't seem like many people who cherish the current exhibit trust that the new exhibit will be good or worth the cost to the state to replace. These comments are echoed through the change.org petitions to save the streets of Old Milwaukee, through the Facebook groups organized to express their anger, and through local talk radio hosts like Dan O'Donnell that I've listened to while researching this podcast.
Now, I guess a lot of people sort of naively believed that a lot of the old favorite exhibits would in some form migrate over. The Milwaukee Record, which is a local website, did an excellent job in sort of digging into this and looking at the museum's own frequently asked questions about the upcoming move to conclude definitively, no.
And you know what? We don't know if the new Milwaukee Revealed gallery will be any good, if it will be a worthy replacement for the streets of Old Milwaukee. The museum has released renderings of the new gallery and provided descriptions of the feelings that the new gallery will evoke in visitors. These renderings are familiar to me, not because I've seen them before, but because I usually join a museum project when it's at this stage. My day job is producing exhibits for various museums, many times new versions of what has come before. The vocal backlash to the Streets of Old Milwaukee closing reminds me that I need to think about my work in the context of the bigger picture. When I'm in a meeting where exhibit designers are excitedly talking about how best to serve the visitor experience, I have to remember that museum goers might have already soured on the process and on the changes long ago. Even the official messaging on the MPM's Facebook page, responding to a question about whether or not the museum would move the Streets of Old Milwaukee, focused on this museum insider excitement that I don't think translates well outside of the museum walls. It said, quote, "As you can imagine, making something new and refreshed, yet familiar and cozy, is a fun challenge for our design team. But there's always change. The current museum on 800 West Wells Street is the fourth location of the museum. The first was in 1882 in rooms of the old German Academy building, the second a few years later in the Industrial Exposition building, and the third in what is still the Milwaukee Central Library. The current building was built in 1963.
And when you look back at the 1960s, at the newspaper articles, you would think you were reading what was going on today. They can't move. It's all the same.
It's really nice to see how meaningful these museums are to my Wisconsin family and to the general public. And it's true that we can only look back like this because the new versions were good. The new versions were better. I'll let Dr. Censky have the final word on this.
A lot of people early on would say to me, "What are you bringing to the new museum? What are you bringing?" And early on, before we had done any of our planning, all I could say is that we are bringing the ingenuity that is the history of this museum forward to that new museum. And that is the way we honor our past, is by continuing to strive to do the next best thing, because that's what the people who did this, they were doing the next best thing, and it's our obligation to honor that and carry that forward.
This has been Museum Archipelago. I have two quick announcements about Club Archipelago, our bonus podcast. I've been having a lot of fun making Club Archipelago, which is kind of a mirror image of Museum Archipelago. While the main show examines the landscape of real museums, Club Archipelago is the podcast that examines museums through the lens of popular culture, like movies and video games. We've built up quite the collection of episodes, from the Night at the Museum series to Toy Story 2, and honestly, I think more people should listen. So I've just added a 7-day free trial to the Patreon. You can sign up, listen to as many episodes as you can, and cancel before the trial is up, completely absolved of any guilt. Of course, you're very welcome to hang around too. To get access to the free trial, just go to jointhemuseum.club. And finally, I'm discontinuing the sticker rewards of the Club Archipelago membership. It's just too much of a logistical challenge to ship things from Bulgaria, and I want to focus all my time on the much more scalable podcast production. But if you're interested, regardless of whether you're a club member or not, just send me an email and I'll let you know where the closest museum is where I've left a pile of stickers for you to collect. For a full transcript of this episode, as well as show notes and links, visit museumarchipelago.com. Thanks for listening. And next time, bring a friend.